The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound cutting through the heavy silence. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long, solemn shadows on the polished wooden floor. Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses and glanced at the list of cases for the day. He had seen hundreds, no, thousands of faces sit before him, some angry, some guilty, some broken. But today, something felt different. The benches were half filled. A few citizens waited for their turn, some anxious, some indifferent. The sound of footsteps echoed from the back. A court officer's voice called out, steady and formal. "Officer, next case, Mr. Samuel Rodriguez." From the back of the courtroom, an elderly man slowly stood up. His back was slightly bent, his movements cautious, like every step cost him effort. He held a worn-out brown hat in his hands, gripping it tightly. The kind of grip that comes not from anger, but from nerves. As he approached the bench, everyone's eyes followed him. His coat was a little too big for him, his shoes scuffed, and his gray hair carefully combed back. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't his appearance. It was the tremor in his hands. When he finally reached the podium, he paused for a moment to catch his breath. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost breaking. "Old man, Samuel." "Good morning, Your Honor." Judge Caprio looked up. His gaze softened the way it often did when he saw kindness in hardship. "Judge Caprio." "Good morning, sir. Take your time. What brings you here today?" Samuel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his hat. For a moment he didn't answer. The courtroom waited. Then in a trembling voice that seemed to carry years of pain, he said, "Samuel, Your Honor, this might be my last day in court, and I have one final wish." The words hit like a sudden gust of wind. The officer at the side of the room shifted uncomfortably. The few people sitting in the gallery turned to look at each other. The silence grew heavier, pressing down like a weight. Judge Caprio's brows furrowed slightly. He leaned forward, his tone gentle but curious. "Judge Caprio, your last day in court? What do you mean by that, sir?" The old man smiled faintly. Not the kind of smile that hides joy, but the kind that hides pain. "Samuel, I don't mean to trouble you, Your Honor. I've been coming here for years, paying fines, facing my mistakes. But this time I wanted to ask for something else." Caprio nodded slowly, sensing that this wasn't going to be a routine case. He set his pen down and folded his hands on the desk. A small gesture, but one that said, "I'm listening." The man continued. His voice cracked as he spoke, the kind of crack that comes from both exhaustion and heartbreak. "Samuel, my daughter, she's been sick for a long time. I take her to the hospital every week, and every time I pass by this courthouse, I tell her, there are still kind people in the world. People who listen, people who care." His voice began to falter. He took a deep breath, Samuel whispering, "But now, her doctors say she doesn't have much time left." The courtroom went still. Even the scribbling of the clerk's pen stopped. Judge Caprio's expression changed, the firmness of law fading into the warmth of empathy. He looked at the man not as a defendant, but as a father. "Judge Caprio," softly. "I'm very sorry to hear that." Samuel nodded, eyes glistening. He wiped a tear quickly, as if ashamed to show it. "Samuel, thank you, Your Honor. I'm not here to ask for mercy for myself. I wanted to make sure that before she goes, she knows her father tried to do the right thing." He took a deep, shaky breath. "Samuel, that's my last wish." The courtroom felt frozen in time. No one dared move. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed to fade. Judge Caprio leaned back slowly, removing his glasses. His eyes glistened as he looked at the frail man before him. In that moment, it wasn't about fines or tickets or the law. It was about two fathers, one sitting on the bench and one standing before it, both bound by the same invisible thread of love and loss. In a courtroom where justice ruled every decision, for a moment, humanity took the gavel. He takes a slow breath, sets his glasses on the bench, and says quietly, "Judge Caprio, sir, Before we talk about any fines or violations, I want you to know your wish is already granted. You've done what every good father dreams of. You stood by your child. Samuel's eyes fill with tears. His lips tremble as he tries to respond but can't. He simply nods, once, clutching his hat to his chest. Or, at that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It became a sanctuary, where love stood taller than law. The courtroom remained silent. No one dared to speak, not even the clerk who usually filled these quiet moments with paperwork. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression full of empathy, but his eyes sharp as ever, searching for the truth behind the man's words. Judge Caprio, softly, "Mr. Rodriguez, can you tell me what brought you here today? I see several citations under your name. Unpaid parking tickets, one for expired registration, another for a no parking zone." The old man, Samuel, nodded slowly. His hands trembled as he placed the crumpled paper he'd been holding on the podium. "Samuel, yes, Your Honor? I know. They're all mine." His voice cracked slightly, but it wasn't the sound of guilt. It was exhaustion. "Judge Caprio, I appreciate your honesty. But tell me, why didn't you pay these fines earlier? There were notices sent to your address, weren't there?" Samuel looked down, as if the weight of his life had suddenly pressed on his shoulders again. "Samuel, I received them, sir. Every one of them. But I didn't have the money to pay. Every time I tried to put a few dollars aside, something happened. A hospital bill, a medication refill, gas to take my daughter to her treatments." The courtroom began to murmur softly. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, sympathy replacing judgment in their eyes. Samuel continued, his voice trembling. "Samuel, my daughter Elena, she's been sick for almost 3 years now. It started with what we thought was just fatigue. But then the doctors found it, cancer. I lost my wife years ago, so it's just been her and me. I sold almost everything I had to keep her treatment going. The car, well, it's old, but it's all I have left. Without it, I couldn't take her to the hospital." Judge Caprio nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He tapped his pen gently on the desk, not out of impatience but deep thought. "Judge Caprio, and every one of these tickets, they were from those trips to the hospital?" Samuel looked up, tears beginning to gather in the corners of his eyes. "Samuel, yes, Your Honor. Every single one. Sometimes I'd park a few blocks away and still get fined. I wasn't thinking about rules or meters. I was just thinking about time. Because when you're watching someone fade away, minutes feel like miracles." He takes a deep breath, visibly moved. "Judge Caprio, sir, I can't imagine what that must be like." Samuel smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "Samuel, she used to love coming to this courthouse when she was a little girl. She'd say, 'Daddy, that's where people find justice?' And I'd tell her, 'Yes, sweetheart. Justice means doing what's right.' But lately, she asked me if justice still exists." He paused, swallowing hard. Samuel, quietly, "I didn't know what to tell her." The courtroom went completely still. Even the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed to fade. Judge Caprio leaned forward again, clasping his hands together. "Judge Caprio, Mr. Rodriguez, I think your daughter already knows what justice looks like. She sees it every day." In you, Samuel blinked, as if the words took a moment to reach him. A tear rolled down his cheek, tracing the lines of age and sorrow carved into his skin. Narrator. The judge's words carried more than compassion. They carried understanding. The kind that comes only from someone who has lived through life's own trials. Judge Caprio, softly. "Tell me something, sir. How is your daughter doing now?" Samuel hesitated, his eyes lowered. "Samuel, she's in hospice now. The doctors said there's not much more they can do." He wiped his eyes quickly, ashamed to cry in public. Samuel, softly. "She told me to come today. She said, 'Dad, go and face them. Don't hide from it.' So I did. I wanted to show her that even if I can't fix everything, I can still do the right thing." A few people in the gallery visibly emotional. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. One man shook his head, overwhelmed. Judge Caprio took a moment, clearly struggling to maintain composure. He looked down at his papers, then back up. Judge Caprio. Mr. Rodriguez, I've been a judge for many years. I've seen every kind of case, anger, greed, pride, carelessness. But what I see before me today isn't any of those things. What I see is love in its purest, most selfless form. Samuel lowered his head, clutching his hat tightly against his chest. Samuel. Thank you, Your Honor. But love doesn't pay tickets. Judge Caprio smiled faintly. A sad smile, the kind that hides empathy behind professionalism. Judge Caprio. No, sir, it doesn't. But sometimes it can erase them. A soft gasp escaped someone in the audience. Samuel looked up, confused. Samuel. I don't understand, Your Honor. Judge Caprio gently. I understand that you've been fined for circumstances beyond your control. The law says you broke a rule, but humanity says you never stopped being a father. He leaned back in his chair, speaking slowly, choosing his words carefully. Judge Caprio, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to review each fine, not by what the ticket says, but by the intent behind it. If those trips were for your daughter's care, then, sir, you've already paid more than enough. Samuel's lips trembled. His eyes widened, not out of relief but disbelief. Samuel, whispering, You mean you're dismissing them? Judge Caprio, firmly but kindly, I'm saying that sometimes mercy is the truest form of justice. In that single moment, the courtroom wasn't divided by power or position. It was united by empathy. The kind of empathy that reminds us why stories like these matter. Samuel wiped his face again, trying to compose himself. Samuel. Thank you, Your Honor. I don't know what to say. Judge Caprio. Just tell your daughter one thing from me. Samuel. What's that, sir? Judge Caprio. Tell her her father did the right thing, not because he paid his dues, but because he never gave up. Samuel's voice cracked. Samuel, softly. She'll be happy to hear that. As Samuel turned to leave, the judge watched him go. A small, fragile man carrying the weight of love, heavier than any law could measure. Some cases are about guilt and innocence, but others, the rare ones, are about humanity. And that day, in that courtroom, humanity won again. The courtroom's air felt lighter after the judge's words, yet something in Samuel's eyes said his story wasn't finished. He didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he gripped the edge of the podium, gathering strength that seemed to come from somewhere far inside him. Judge Caprio, gently. Mr. Rodriguez, is there anything else you'd like to tell the court? Samuel looked down at his weathered hands. The silence stretched long enough for the ticking wall clock to sound like a heartbeat. Samuel. Yes, Your Honor. There's something I never told anyone. Not the police, not the hospital, not even my daughter. Camera tight on Caprio's face, concerned but calm. Judge Caprio. Take your time, sir. Samuel drew a shaky breath. Samuel. 3 years ago, the night she was diagnosed, I was the one driving the car. We were late coming home from the hospital and I wasn't careful. There was an accident. A faint gasp rippled through the courtroom. Samuel, Kant. A boy on a bicycle crossed the street too fast. He fell. He broke his arm. It was my fault. The police let me go because I paid for everything. His treatment, his therapy. But that night my daughter looked at me and said, Daddy, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do next. He paused, his throat tight. Samuel, I decided I'd spend the rest of my life doing what's right, no matter how small, helping people, forgiving when I could. But I could never forgive myself, narrator. The judge's eyes softened. The courtroom felt less like a hall of law and more like a confessional. Judge Caprio, so these tickets, these trips to the hospital, they were your way of making peace with your own mistake? Samuel nodded slowly. Samuel, yes, Your Honor. Every day I told my daughter I was doing better, but inside I was still carrying that guilt. And now that she's leaving soon, I don't want to carry it anymore. That's my real wish. That before she goes, she knows her father was an honest man. It wasn't a legal confession. It was a human one. The kind that no sentence could undo and no law could punish. Judge Caprio leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench. Judge Caprio. Mr. Rodriguez, you've already served your sentence. Not in a cell, but in your heart. What you feel is remorse, and remorse is the first step toward redemption. Samuel's eyes filled again. Samuel, softly. I just needed someone to hear it. Judge Caprio. And now someone has. For years, Samuel had carried his burden like a stone in his pocket. Heavy, unseen. In 30 minutes of truth, that stone finally fell away. The judge took a slow breath, his voice lowering to a tone of compassion few had ever heard from a bench. Judge Caprio. Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to go home today and sit beside your daughter. Hold her hand and tell her this story yourself. Not as a confession, but as a lesson. That even when we make mistakes, we can choose to be better. Samuel nodded, tears now falling freely. Samuel. She always says she wants to see me smile one last time. Maybe now. I can. The gallery was silent except for the soft sound of someone sniffling in the back. What happened next was not written in any rulebook. The judge rose from his seat, something he rarely did during a hearing. He walked down from the bench and stood beside Samuel. Two men of different ages, different lives, but the same heart. Judge Caprio, quietly so only he could hear. You've done your duty as a father. Now go be with your daughter. The courtroom doesn't need you today. She does. Samuel looked up, astonished. Samuel. Thank you, Your Honor, for seeing me as a man, not a case. Judge Caprio. That's what justice should be, Mr. Rodriguez. He turned back toward his bench as Samuel began to leave, then spoke once more, not to him alone, but to everyone in the room. Judge Caprio, firm but warm. Let this be a reminder to us all. The law can teach obedience, but only compassion can teach understanding. The words echoed long after Samuel had gone. The court officer stood still, the clerk lowered her pen, and even the gallery remained in their seats, as if they had just witnessed something sacred. Outside, the sunlight had grown warmer. Samuel stepped into it, closing his eyes for a moment. For the first time in years, he felt light. Samuel, voiceover, she'll be waiting for me. And I'll tell her, her father kept his promise. In that moment, a parking ticket became a testament, a courtroom became a chapel, and justice found its truest form, in forgiveness. Camera returns to Judge Caprio, back on the bench, sitting quietly. He looked down at the next case file waiting on his desk, then closed it slowly. Judge Caprio, murmuring to himself, sometimes the law must listen to the heart. He placed his hand on the file and took a deep breath before calling the next case. In a world that often measures right and wrong by numbers and penalties, Judge Frank Caprio reminded everyone that justice without mercy is empty, and that sometimes the greatest verdict is understanding. The courtroom sat in absolute silence. Judge Frank Caprio leaned back in his chair, his eyes glistening, his lips pressed together as if holding back words that carried more weight than any law book could bear. Across the room, Samuel stood quietly. The lines on his face told stories that no testimony could capture. Stories of love, mistakes, and redemption. Camera close-up. Judge Caprio lowers his glasses, takes a deep breath. Judge Caprio, softly. Mr. Rodriguez, in my years on this bench, I've heard many stories. Some about pain, some about regret. But yours? He pauses, voice trembling slightly. Yours reminds me why this seat doesn't belong to power. It belongs to understanding. His words weren't just for Samuel. They were for everyone in the courtroom, for the officers, for the spectators, and maybe even for himself. The judge turned slightly, his gaze softening. Judge Caprio, you said your daughter is fighting her illness? Samuel, yes, Your Honor. She's still at the hospital. She wanted to come today, but she was too weak. Judge Caprio, nodding slowly. I want you to tell her something from me. Tell her that her father stood in this courtroom today and reminded us all what real courage looks like. Samuel's lip trembled. His eyes filled again. Samuel, softly. Thank you, Your Honor. She always says you're her favorite judge. She watches your videos to see how you care for people. For the first time that morning, Judge Caprio smiled, a tired, humble smile that carried years of compassion behind it. He leaned forward, his tone both judicial and deeply personal. Judge Caprio, Mr. Rodriguez, I've reviewed your tickets, your record, and your honesty here today. The law might say you owe a fine, but I see something far greater paid in full. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Judge Caprio, continuing, you've spent your life paying with kindness, with guilt, and with love. No amount of money can equal that. He paused again, then looked directly into Samuel's eyes. Judge Caprio, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm dismissing your tickets. Every one of them, Judge Caprio, firm but gentle. You don't owe the city anything. What you owe is to yourself and your daughter. Spend that time not in courtrooms but beside her. Make memories that neither time nor illness can take away. Samuel's tears finally fell freely. He placed a hand over his chest. Samuel, I don't know what to say, Your Honor. Judge Caprio, you've already said it, son. You said it with honesty, and that's the language every heart understands. A long pause filled the courtroom, not the silence of procedure, but the silence of emotion too big for words. Judge Caprio removed his glasses and wiped his eyes, his hand trembling slightly. Judge Caprio, softly, almost whispering, you know, I lost someone once too, and I promised myself that if I ever sat in a place of judgment, I'd never forget what it means to lose, to hurt, to love. The courtroom officer glanced down, visibly moved. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment. In that space, between justice and humanity, something sacred happened. A courtroom became a sanctuary. Judge Caprio, standing. Mr. Rodriguez, please come forward. Samuel hesitated, then stepped closer to the bench. Judge Caprio, emotion thick in his voice. I want to shake your hand. He reached over, and the two men's hands met, old and worn, yet strong. For a brief second, time seemed to stand still. The cameras might have captured the moment, but what they couldn't show was the weight of understanding behind it. Two human beings meeting in grace. Judge Caprio, still holding his hand. You've done your part. Now go give that little girl the smile she's waiting for. Samuel with a tearful laugh. I will, Your Honor. I promise, Judge Caprio. Good. Then this court has done its duty today. The gallery couldn't hold back their emotions. A few clapped quietly, others wiped away tears. Even the bailiff nodded with pride, as if he too had learned something about justice that day. Outside the courthouse, the city carried on. Cars honking, people rushing. But for one man, the world had slowed down. Samuel looked up at the sky, the sunlight catching his tears. Samuel, voiceover. She'll be waiting for me, and this time, I'll go without any guilt in my heart. He placed his hat back on, stood tall, and began to walk. Cut back to courtroom. Judge Caprio sat quietly, his hands clasped, eyes distant. A small frame photo of his own late parents sat beside his gavel, a reminder of where his compassion began. Judge Caprio, softly to himself. The law can punish mistakes, but only love can heal them. He looked toward the door Samuel had exited through, then turned back to the courtroom. Judge Caprio, raising his voice gently. Next case, please. And just like that, justice continued. But something unseen had changed. In the judge, in the people, maybe even in the city itself. Because sometimes the most powerful verdicts are not spoken from authority. They're whispered from the heart. As the sound of the gavel faded, a stillness filled the courtroom. Not the kind that follows a verdict, but the kind that lingers when hearts are full. Judge Frank Caprio sat quietly, staring at the papers in front of him, though his eyes weren't reading anymore. They were remembering. Camera close-up. Caprio's face calm, his glasses resting beside him, A soft light from the window touches his desk. Moments like this came often for him. Moments when the weight of the robe felt heavier than usual. Not because of the law it represented, but because of the humanity it demanded. He leaned back slightly, his fingers interlaced, as though holding on to a memory. Judge Caprio, softly, almost to himself. Some days this bench feels like more than just wood and law. It feels like a place where the world comes to remember what kindness looks like. He wasn't just a judge. He was a listener, a witness to the stories of ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens. And today, Samuel's story had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten. That mercy isn't weakness. It's strength guided by love. Outside, the sun shone brighter than it had that morning. Life went on, but something in Judge Caprio's heart had shifted. Close-up of Judge Caprio writing a note on his desk. Judge Caprio, to every father trying his best, to every daughter waiting for love, and to every person walking through their hardest day, remember, compassion costs nothing, but it changes everything. He folded the note gently, placing it inside the small leather notebook that always sat beside his gavel. It wasn't part of the case record, but part of something greater, a growing collection of silent reminders that justice, at its purest, is an act of grace. Every person who stepped into that courtroom brought their pain with them. Some carried anger, others guilt, and some, like Samuel, carried love so heavy it nearly broke them. And Judge Caprio knew every judgment was a mirror, reflecting not just the person before him, but the kind of person he wanted to be. Later that evening, as he walked down the courthouse steps, the world around him seemed quieter. The orange glow of sunset touched the old bricks, and the air carried a calm after a storm. He stopped for a moment, watching a young man help his elderly mother cross the street. He smiled, a faint, knowing smile. Judge Caprio, softly to himself. That's what justice looks like. Not in words, but in actions. He thought of Samuel and his daughter. Somewhere across the city, a father was holding his child's hand, not worried about fines or tickets, just grateful for time. And that, Judge Caprio thought, was worth more than any verdict. The truth is, behind every case number lies a heartbeat. Behind every decision lies a choice, to punish or to understand. Judge Caprio chose to understand. Judge Caprio, voiceover. I've learned something after all these years. People don't remember the fines you give. They remember the kindness you show, and that kindness became his legacy. Not written in law books, but etched into the lives he touched. Cut to interior shot. Empty courtroom. Chairs neatly arranged. Sunlight falling across the bench. Tomorrow, new faces would walk through that door. New stories, new struggles, new chances to remind the world that even in a place built for judgment, there's room for mercy. But for now, the courtroom rested, and so did its judge, Judge Caprio. Justice without compassion is just procedure. But justice with compassion, that's humanity. And maybe that's what makes this bench different. It doesn't just deliver justice, it delivers peace. Because in this courtroom, every story matters. Every tear has meaning. And every heart, even the broken ones, find a little hope. The emotional bench where justice meets compassion.